Scrapwood challenge, Scrapwood challenge. It's crap, it's firewood, but some of the wood is good.
It's been a while since I made a Scrapwood challenge project, so in today's video I'll attempt to make a ship's wheel from this old reclaimed timber that's well past its best. It's been stored outside and it's starting to rot away, so I'll get straight into it, and the first thing I'll do is sand off the paint with a 40 grit disc just so I can have a better look at the wood beneath. A ship's wheel has been on my ideas list for a few years, and a few weeks ago I went to a local Collectorama where I saw a few of them for sale. After having a good look at them, I really like the joinery that's involved, so I decided to get going and make one. I made a 3D design, so I had dimensions to work off, and even though this wood is far from perfect, I think I can make it work, so let's start ripping it down into usable pieces. You can see here that a lot of it has quite a few of these soft areas, and this piece is pretty solid, but it has deep staples all along the one edge. I can get a piece from the opposite edge though, and I can use that for the spokes. I'm working out what I can get from it and whether there's enough for all the pieces that I need. There's the spokes, the rim, the hub, and then there's going to be some trim as well. I'm cutting it down into more manageable lengths, then I can get on with cutting and planing it to dimension. There's a bit of preparation involved as the wood has its challenges, but I reckon it's worth getting it all into a decent place before diving into the actual project. Of course, it would be easier to use premium timber, but the beauty of scrapwood is that it's usually free, and with a bit of effort it can still be made into awesome projects. These are the pieces for the spokes. I'll need 10 of them, and I'll cut off the edge with the staples first, then plane them down. It really doesn't look the best, but hopefully I can plane down those bad areas and get down to some decent wood without the pieces getting too thin. Now I'm cutting them down to just over the final dimension, and as the spokes need to be square to start with, I'll put them through the thicknesser, flip them 90 degrees and put them through again to get them even. That's the blanks for the spokes prepared. Next I'll quickly get the other pieces squared up and into decent shape, and then I'll get into the project proper. And that's all the pieces prepared. I'm still not sure that was quite enough though, as I'm hoping to get the trim out of the offcuts. The first thing I'll make is the spokes. I'll make a quick template to use as a guide while turning them on the lathe. I usually use my lathe in the far back corner of my workshop, but the light isn't very good there. It's not good for filming and it's not good for seeing what I'm doing, so I'll set it up on my workbench in the middle of the workshop. The wood is very dense, and I think it's Jarrah by the way. It's super brittle and it splinters easily. Because of that, and because I need to transition in a couple of areas from square to turned, I'll first mark out and make cuts with a saw. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I think it's my best chance. Otherwise, I think whatever turning tool I use, it's going to splinter and take off the corners. And I know that because I quickly turned a piece to see how it would go, and this is what happened. I turned that one with traditional turning gouges, mainly the spindle gouge, but as I'm no wood turner, I've decided to play it safe and use the much easier scraping tools. I will learn and practice more with the gouges when I get the right project, but with the material on this one, this isn't it. As well as making those cuts, I've decided to stabilise the corners and protect them even further. I'm wicking in this Bondi Bond, which is my very own product. It's a premium CA glue and available on my website, which I'll put a link to in the description. As I said, I'm using the thin Bondi Bond here, but it also comes with medium and thick along with activator. I reckon if you're after CA glue, you should give it a try, and at the same time you're supporting me and my channel, and also a big thank you to everyone that's already purchased it. That worked very well and seems like the go. You can see what would have happened on the other side of the groove, which doesn't matter as that still needs turning down, which I'll do next with the roughing gouge. Now I'll transfer marks from the template onto the turn section. I'll then cut grooves down to the correct depth at each location. Then I'll be able to turn the shape of the spoke using the grooves as guides. By using this method, I should be able to keep all 10 spokes fairly consistent. As I mentioned earlier, I tried using the spindle gouge to make the beads, but when I thought I got the hang of it, I got to run back and ruined what I'd already done. I think using these scraping tools is definitely the way to go for me. They don't leave as nice a finish and requires more sanding, but the wood isn't the best, so probably would have needed a good sanding anyway. That went pretty well. Next I need to slightly round over the corners. I didn't even consider turning them, so I'll try using a saw rasp, which I think will be a safer bet and shouldn't blow out those corners. That went better than I thought it would, and before I sand the spoke, I'll refine some of the turning a bit more with a small rasp. As I said, I don't mind admitting I'm no wood turner. Just like most things I do, I'm just giving it a go. I went through quite a few grits of sandpaper up to 400 and then finished it with a piece of Scotch-Brite. That wasn't too bad. Now for the other 9, and hopefully I can get them all the same. They came out great, but I did have a problem with one of them where I caught the corner and it blew out. I don't have enough material prepared to make another one, so I've decided to replace the damaged square section. I'll turn it down to a tenon and then make a square piece to glue it into. For the square section, I had to glue 2 pieces of scrap together. I trimmed it down to square off camera, so all I need to do is drill it out for the tenon to fit into. I left it overnight to set, and I reckon you'd do very well to notice it. As far as repairs go, I think that one came out great. I just need to scrape the CA glue off all the spokes, and then I can move on to the next part, which is the hub. I've got a super nice hook on the card scraper, and I use my Niroc Tools solid carbide burnisher to do that. If you're interested in one, I'll put a link in the description. The drawing's a bit messy, but the hub will look something like this. I'll make it from segmented pieces, but as far as I know, many of them would have been made from solid brass. That would have been really cool to cast it in brass, but I'm not set up for it, and also it would have used quite a lot of material. I haven't mentioned it yet, but this is going to hang here in the workshop, although I'm not exactly sure where. So anyway, as it's only for decoration, the hub will be fine made out of wood. I do plan on making a brass plate to cover it up and give it the same sort of look as an original one. I left it to set while I went for lunch. I've printed out a template which I'll stick onto the hub and then I'll cut it out on the bandsaw. I thought of different ways of doing this accurately, including using the milling machine, but in the end I decided to keep it simple and just cut it out up to the lines. Because the grain is running across the fingers, they'll be pretty weak and would easily break off. When the spokes are glued in though, it will become one solid piece, making it plenty strong enough. Next I need to taper the ends of the spokes to fit further into the pockets. I'll keep it simple using this jig that I just quickly put together. I need to glue a small piece on which will be a stop, and I've picked out a reference point on the spoke to ensure that they all come out the same and consistent. I didn't get the first one quite right, so I'll adjust the jig before cutting the rest of them, and this one will just have to be glued in the right position. None of the spokes are cut to the correct length and a few of them need trimming down. I should have cut them the same before starting, but I'm working a lot of this out as I go along and I thought I could do it later. Anyway, it's still working out okay. Even though I don't show it, I went back and forth to the belt sander making adjustments and refining the fit for each spoke. I'll mark each one so they can go back in the correct position. I haven't decided yet how I'll mount this to the wall, but to keep it authentic, I'll make the bore square. I could have drilled it round and added a keyway, and ship's wheels seem to use one of these methods, but I like the square bore on a round hub as I think it looks pretty cool. There's a few voids where the segmented pieces didn't quite reach towards the centre enough, but it'll be fine, and as I said, I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to mount it yet, and it may be covered up anyway. Next I'll start the outer rim. I've cut an 18-degree angle on one end. I just need to work out what length to cut it to, and to help work that out I'll measure across each section and take an average. It's starting to look a bit like a wheel. Next I'll cut a groove into the rim pieces, and I'll also cut one into the spoke for a key to fit into and lock it all together. That will keep all the pieces locked in and in the correct position. Now I'll mark the rims ready to make them circular, and to help with that I've made a block to put in the centre. I'm just checking that everything is consistent and it looks good, so I'll mark out the rim. And I'll label all these pieces as well so they go back in the same place. I was going to just sand to the line by eye, but I've decided instead I'll use a template to keep them all consistent. You probably expect that I'd do this with the pattern following route a bit, but I'm certain that this splintery grain would just tear out and make a real mess, so instead I'll use this setup on my belt sander. I have a piece of plywood to match the wheel on the sander. The template will run along that and keep the workpiece flush with it. I've done this before and it works very well. There's more dust, but it does a better job and no tear out. If I had the right belt, this would go even faster. This one is made for grinding steel and it's a bit worn out. It's working, but it's nowhere near as efficient as it could be. Taking a look at it from above, it looks round and consistent, so next I'll take each piece and I'll put a big round over along the edges. The easiest way to do this would be a large round over router bit, which I do have, but as I said earlier, that will take chunks out of this wood. So again, I'll use the belt sander. I'll sand chamfers on first and then smooth those out afterwards into a round over. I really do like this method and it does such a good job. That's the first one done, so I'll get the rest of them up to the same stage and then I'll sand in a second chamfer, which will be enough to round over by hand. It takes a minute or so to get the angle and the position of the table just right, and then it's super easy to get the perfect chamfer. I've ordered some new belts which would have done this in quarter of the time. The other thing I don't like about routing pieces like this with a large bit is the start of the cut. In fact, it's one thing on power tools that really does terrify me, so I'm definitely happier with this method on the belt sander. I've cut a couple of blocks to clamp each piece in the vise with a bit of room to work around. I'll mark the centre of the flats and that'll give me a guide of where to sand to. I'm using 120 grit sandpaper. I could have gone coarser, but it only took a couple of minutes to sand each side. The only thing I did different on the others was to set up some dust collection. It's starting to come together and nearly ready for gluing up, but first I'll round over the handle end of the spokes. I'll keep it simple and use the belt sander. I've flipped the platen around so the belt has some give, which will soften the sanding. I got them all pretty well shaped, then went up a couple of grits. I used 120 and then 240. It's been a fair amount of work, but that's all the pieces ready to assemble. The spokes go in fairly easily, but when the last one goes in, it really tightens them all up. As far as glue ups go, that wasn't too bad at all. I left it overnight to set, and this is the next morning. Next I'll make the trim, which goes on the face of the outer rim and across the spokes. This looks like plenty of material, but a lot of it really is very poor quality. I don't show it, but I didn't quite have enough, so I had to sand the paint off and prepare an extra piece. The ring will be made of segments. There's 10 again, like everything else, so again they're cut at 18 degrees on each end. I only have one of these band clamps, so I glued the second one just using masking tape. Even though I've stayed away from using the router so far, there really isn't a good alternative for making these into a full ring. So this time I'll use a router and hope I don't get too much tear out. I'll use masking tape and Bondi bond with accelerator to glue down the standoffs to the workbench and then the ring to the standoffs. I'll also need a centre block for a circle cutting jig to pivot on. My circle cutting jig is pretty crude. It's just a piece of scrap plywood attached to the router, but it works perfectly well and it only took a few minutes to make and I've used it heaps of times. To give me the best chance of limiting tear out, I'm taking light passes. I think I took 5 in total to get to the full depth. It did a pretty good job. It's not perfect. There are a couple of spots that'll need filling, but it could have been much worse. That's the outside done. Now the same on the inside. This is the one for the back of the wheel, and I didn't mention earlier, but I picked 10 segments that were the most even and the best looking for the front ring. I'm happy with how that turned out now for the front one. Some of the tear out won't be seen as the bottom of the ring will be sunk into a recess that I need to make on the wheel, and also the top edges need rounding over, which I'll do by hand as I don't want to risk tear out with the router on the front edge. I'll start with the chamfer and then round it over. I use the coarse side of the saw rasp to establish the first chamfer. Next I'll use the fine side to chamfer the chamfers. That's the rings done. Next I need to route a recess for the ring to fit into. I could have made the rings shallower and just glued them on. That would have been a lot easier, but as I mentioned, I really like the joinery that's involved in this project, and that's what's interesting me, and that includes these pieces sunk into the wheel and further locking it all together. Before I do route the recess, I'll sand everything back smooth first. The recess is only a few millimetres deep, so I did this in 2 passes, but I took it slow to minimise tear out. I was so confident this was going to be a good fit, but it isn't. The recess is too big for the ring. I'm pretty disappointed with it, and it's my own stupid mistake. It actually looks much worse than it does on camera. The reason it happened is I got sloppy and I didn't lock the plunge mechanism down on the router, which you can see here is extremely wobbly, and the reason the ring is all over the place. I'll route the recess on the back while I have a think about how I can fix the front. It's a shame I didn't do the back first, as I could have probably just lived with the gaps or even filled them. That's much better. It's a tight fit. It probably needs a bit of easing, but it would go down with some help from a few clamps. I could swap the wheel around and make the back the front, but there really are too many irregularities and I wouldn't be happy with it. Anyway, I have a plan. I'll route the recesses wider still and add a thin accent strip, but this time I'll lock the router down and cut them accurately. Here's the wood that I'll use for the strips. It's the lightest colour wood I have, which I think is silver top stringy bark. I was looking for some of this recently on another project and I thought I'd run out, but luckily I found this piece. I think that should work, so I'll glue it in with the ring at the same time. I was originally going to glue and clamp both rings at the same time, but because of the front ring glue being a bit more involved, I thought I'd better do it separately. I scraped some of the glue off where I could get to it, but there'll be a lot more of that when the clamps come off. I'll trim the accent strips flush, then go over the whole thing, scraping glue out of the corners and sanding it ready to finish. I really enjoy these types of projects, making something for no other reason than it's just fun and it's a cool item, even though it hasn't actually got a use. Unless you own a ship, I suppose, but obviously that's not the reason I'm making it. It's a pretty epic project and I reckon it's going to look awesome on the wall. What do you think? Is it a worthwhile project or just a waste of time? It took the best part of a day to sand it, definitely not the easiest item to prepare for finish. Anyway, let's put some finish on and I've decided to spray it with clear satin. I'll put one coat on first to seal it. When it's dry, I'll sand it back smooth, fill the cracks and any voids like the odd bit of tear out. Overall, it looks pretty decent considering how poor the wood was to start with. To sand it smooth, I'll use fine wire wool, and I should also mention at this point that I always intended to finish the wheel in this video with all the hardware. It needs a brass hub and a brass ring around the trim and some way of mounting it to the wall, but I'll save that for later. Let me know if you think I should film it and whether that's something you'd like to see. I ended up putting a good amount of coats on. I can't quite remember how many, but it has a decent build-up. As I mentioned, it still needs the brass hardware, which will set it off and finish it properly. I really enjoyed this one. Hopefully you enjoyed it too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.